Yao Emei's The Unfilial has the subtitle Four Tragic Tales from Modern China. These tragedies are played out on a small scale, personal level, often revolving around the family. For this reason, The Unfilial offers often gritty insights into some of the concerns and struggles facing ordinary people in contemporary China. And it gives us an alternative to sometimes skewed national narratives, both from outside and from within the country. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode I invite experts to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm joined by Spence and Olivia Milburn, two of the translators. I hope our conversation inspires you to read The Unfilial, and if you have anything to say about the stories or our conversation, please leave us a comment. And if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. The Unfilial will be published on the 28th of September by Sinois Books, and I'd like to say a big thank you to them for providing me with a copy ahead of publication. I will link to the details of the book in the description below. I'm joined today by Spence and Olivia Milburn, two of the translators of the stories in The Unfilial. Will is a translator of Chinese fiction and non-fiction, and his work to date includes The Book of Secrets and The Promise, both by Xinran, That Which Can't Be Washed Away by Xu Huaizhong, and China Adorned by Deng Qiyao. In The Unfilial, he translated the first story, which is called It Runs in the Family. Olivia is professor in the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong. Her translations include a number of Feng Jisai's works, including The Enemies of Art, From Purgatory to Paradise, an oral history of artist Han Mei Lin from the Cultural Revolution to the present day, which is a mouthful to say, which she translated with Yukteswar Kumar, A Looking Glass World, Faces in the Crowd, 36 Extraordinary Tales of Tianjin. She's also translated Fang Fang's The Walls of Wuchang and Su Tong's Open Air Cinema, Reminiscences and Micro-Essays from the author of Raise the Red Lantern, and that was done together with Nikki Harman, James Trapp and Hai Wang Yuan. In The Unfilial, she translated the second story, which is called Gran is on her way. It's a pleasure to welcome Will and Olivia to the World Literature Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, Will and Olivia. And we're discussing Yao Emei's The Unfilial, a collection of 4 short stories. So maybe we could just begin by you each telling me a little bit about the story you translated, why people might find it interesting, anything else of note. So Will, yours comes first in the collection. Could you say a little bit about It Runs in the Family?
Sure. So It Runs in the Family is the quite on-the-nose title of one family struggles over several generations. And it's set in an unnamed town somewhere in the south. It doesn't specify, but just south of the Yangtze River. And it's narrated by a middle-aged woman who starts by recounting a very recent incident involving her nephew that's really shocked the local community. And this leads her to kind of reflect on other past incidents involving members of her family, particularly the men. And this kind of leads her again to question why these bad things keep happening to them. And so without giving anything of the plot away, it's you have these kind of 2 interwoven strands of the narrative, the past and the present. And as the story unfolds, you start to notice kind of various recurring themes and repeated patterns of behavior within the family, which can go at least some way to explaining and answering that question of, what's wrong with us. So I guess in a nutshell, it's about how the actions of past generations affect the lives of people today.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And Olivia, you translated the second, which is called Gran is on Her Way. The title sounds like it might be a sort of nice, quaint story. It is not.
It
To give
really
a
isn't.
little bit of a spoiler, could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yes, so I mean, again, trying not to give away too much of the story, the main character becomes involved in human trafficking, and he's part of a ring of people who are taking babies out of a hospital and selling them. And the story is about basically the workings of this ring and the way that they try and justify what it is that they're doing to themselves, because the members of this ring mostly feel that they are benefiting the babies that they're selling, sometimes saving these children from abortion, sometimes rescuing children that would otherwise be abandoned or in really, really poor circumstances. And there's a heavy dollop again of generational trauma involved here, with a lot of these people having really, really horrendous lives. So yeah, the ring becomes unraveled, and there are various revelations involved with that, whereby they have to, the members of the ring really have to think about what it is that they've been doing. But yeah, they have been selling babies.
And I mean, I'll start with you, Olivia. You know, selling babies and, you know, this term human trafficking, these just seem, you know, the connotations of these are quite horrific. Obviously, the title of the collection is The Unfilial. And Chinese culture has traditionally placed great emphasis on filial piety. The title then is suggesting these values are changing, perhaps, in contemporary China. Do you think of the unfilial as descriptive, or is it more critical? And by that, I mean, is it just sort of setting out to describe how society is changing, or is there a kind of stronger strand of judgment, either towards those values and maybe problems with them, or towards the move away from them?
Well, I mean, the whole concept of filial piety, that's always been innately controversial, because I think most people, I guess, would think of the role of children to respect their parents. But of course, there have always been people that wanted filial piety to be about becoming a good parent, in which case your motivation and your actions may actually be quite reversed. I mean, you may have to be, as it were, unfilial to your own parents in order to become a good ancestor, because you're prioritizing your children. So I guess, you know, it is kind of playing on, the title does play on this idea of filial piety and what is filial and what is unfilial. And of course, in my story, the people who buy these babies, I guess in at least some cases, would argue that doing that is genuinely filial. They're carrying on their family line through adoption, and that's positive. And the parents of these children, I mean, some of these women knowingly sell their babies. They take money for the children, and they justify it to themselves with the idea that I am being a good parent because my baby is going to go to some people who are better and can do more for them and give them a better life than I can. And so, yeah, unfilial is a really loaded term. I mean, very culturally loaded, of course, but it's also always ironic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you say about the motivations of the characters, from that brief introduction you gave, you might think it's just sort of going to eviscerate these people, but it's not told in that way at all, is it? Yeah.
It's not, no, really not. Insofar as there is a villain aspect in the story that I translated, it's the main character's boyfriend who's absolutely awful.
Yeah.
And she has this really horrendous codependent relationship with him, but that's not really part of the, you can argue that's where the sort of evil aspect comes from. And then the whole baby selling, I mean, a lot of these people think that they're making the best decision they can to help these children.
Yeah. And I mean,
could I just jump in and say one thing about, I think it might be worth adding that the original Chinese title actually translates to something more like family lives, feels kind of more neutral. And so as Olivia was just saying, the Unfilial feels like a much more loaded, kind of provocative, almost kind of title. And actually I haven't actually read the other stories apart from mine, but just hearing a little bit about the grand story and thinking about my story, or the story I translated, it almost feels like more defiant, saying the unfilial, because it's quite a judgmental term, isn't it? Saying that you're unfilial. And it almost feels like a kind of reclamation of that term to demonstrate that perhaps it's actually not such a bad thing. And, we are being unfilial, but that in itself isn't inherently wrong in the way that you think it is. And that might be kind of projecting my own ideas onto the story. And like I said, it wasn't even the original title, but it's just a kind of thought I had about that word.
I mean, that's an interesting detail. Do you know whose decision it was then to translate the title in that way?
I think it was collective, but I guess Daniel, I think. And
yes,
I might be wrong, but I think it just came down to kind of SEO business, and just the fact that family lives was too generic, and there's probably already
too many books already had that title, so they weren't happy to keep.
And like you both just said, unfilial, both filial and unfilial, it's fun. Like when I see those words, like it does feel. I always think of it as a word that's in translation, because it's kind of a concept which sort of carries a lot more kind of currency in China and maybe Asia as well, rather than in the UK, where it's kind of uncommon, like old-fashioned even, I would say.
So it does have that sort of exoticizing effect on the, a reader, say in the UK, code it as belonging to something else. Daniel, who you just referred to, Daniel Lee at Sinus Books, I presume.
Yeah, sorry, the publisher.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And actually, picking up on Olivia, you just made the point the boyfriend in Gran is on the Way is awful, and sort of that responsibility almost gets kicked down the lane to the female characters, right? Will, you mentioned earlier that the male characters in It Runs in the Family are the ones who suffer misfortune. So, I mean, how do you think these depictions, how do you think that kind of structure, recurring structure of misfortune in your story, how do these tie into traditional concepts of gender roles in China as they pertain to men, or by extension to changing roles of women as well?
I think it's interesting because it is primarily the men, well, maybe not primarily, but the men suffer, but the women suffer also. And I think the big difference there is that the men, at least for the most part, suffer as a result of their own kind of indiscretions or their own bad judgment, whereas the women tend to suffer as a result of men's actions, and in many cases are kind of powerless to do anything about it. So when the father, for example, he is jailed for racketeering, he not only kind of goes down himself, but it ends up ruining one of his daughter's relationships with her boyfriend, who's this kind of young police officer. And then when you skip forward a few years, you see that she ends up marrying this kind of bit of a deadbeat guy who works in a factory, and they don't have a happy relationship. So you have that kind of, they both suffer, but there's a kind of implied difference in the reasons why they suffer.
Mm.
So I guess if you think, I think you could say that portraying women in this way, suffering as a result of men, it's kind of an indictment of those traditional gender roles that you mentioned, where women's roles are kind of limited to those of wives and mothers, carers of some kind within a patriarchal structure.
Mm.
And I think it suggests that these structures not only keep women down, but it kind of impose a kind of negative worldview. When I was rereading the story recently, I was quite struck by this line, which I don't remember at the time, but I thought it was interesting that the narrator describes how from a very young age she's adopted this very pessimistic view of the world as a kind of defense mechanism against it.
Mm.
And so her thinking is that you'll never be overly disappointed if you always expect like the absolute worst in any kind of situation.
Mm.
And I think that that also kind of explains that the tone of the writing is very interesting, I think, because even though what's often described as very traumatic and kind of or dramatic, the tone is always quite understated.
Mm.
Women almost come across as kind of apathetic and indifferent to all the things that have happened to them. And what that says about the kind of changing role of women in society, yeah, I think it's quite pessimistic on that. And it's certainly not a story of female empowerment, at least in terms of what I read it. How I read
Yeah,
it.
it interestingly pick up on the sort of psychological effects and worldview that it generates. Because I think on a first reading, I was very much, you think about the effects in material and physical terms, pregnancy, which I'll come to in a moment, but also, money and living space and all these things. But you're right that actually there's this in one sense, quite pessimistic worldview, but then this kind of apathy that comes from it. I mean, Olivia, would you say in your story, Will seemed to be saying it's a fairly kind of clear indictment of, the roles and expectations of women. Would you say it's similar in Gran is on the Way?
In some respects, except that throughout my stories, the translation, this story is set in the hospital, and they have a maternity unit which is occupied by relatively wealthy women, and those women are shown with positive economic circumstances. They can afford pretty good treatment, and not just that, they really have social support. I mean, they've got their husbands there, their families there. When they are pregnant, when they are giving birth, they feel really loved and supported, and that's then contrasted with the women from poorer economic circumstances that are in the kind of general maternity ward, and that's where the babies for trafficking are coming from. And so you're seeing a real social inequality, but in addition to the social inequality, there's also the difference with the family care. You get the women basically being dragged in by abusive men, and they're looking at having to go back out of the hospital into grinding poverty with a horrible man and a newborn baby to look after. And you can absolutely see that the lack of social support and comfort is really a big factor in why they make the decisions that they are.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, much of that story takes place in and around a maternity ward. And in fact, unplanned or unwanted pregnancies are central to both stories. In Gran is on the Way, as we've already mentioned, these unwanted children become a source of profit. Now, as you've already said, that's not represented entirely in negative terms, and the decisions are kind of understandable from certain perspectives. And you have just mentioned also the sort of wealth inequality aspect of the story as well. So do you think, is the story kind of critiquing a materialistic society in which family bonds are breaking down, or actually is the sort of social fragmentation that we see providing the characters with opportunities, with choices they might not otherwise have? Is there some positive in this quite bleak picture, do you think?
I mean, in a way, I don't know whether this is what Yao Emei, the author, intended, but the way I read this is very much as a return to the way that things used to be. Because human trafficking and selling infants for adoption used to be really, really common. And then once you have the Communist Party in charge, they basically stamped that out, the whole of the Maoist era. And then once you have liberation of opening up and whatever, then reform and opening up, then one of the things that happens is you get human trafficking back again, and this particular form of people buying really cute babies in the desired gender for continuing the family line, and that there's an argument for saying that what you're looking at is not any kind of modern issue, not any kind of commentary or reflection on, China today. What you're looking at is a return to old ways of doing things.
Will, is, childbirth in your story as well plays a big part. Do you have a similar read to Olivia, or do you think your story figures that a bit differently?
I think it figures a bit differently, because I think I didn't actually, and maybe this was just a kind of personal reading, but I didn't really read a materialistic angle into the story that I translated. They kind of, I mean, money is a concern for the family and that they need to make ends meet, but it's not their main concern. And I wouldn't say it's the source of their suffering either. And the unwanted pregnancies that happen in this story, and the kind of breakdown of family bonds in general, I don't think it happens as a result of this being a kind of more materialistic society. I think it's a kind of other kind of moral failures and a kind of failure to acknowledge past mistakes. And I think I mentioned before how the fact that it's in an intergenerational story is very pertinent, because it's about the kind of history repeating itself and people making the same mistakes over and over again. And actually the unwanted pregnancies is, I mean, it's kind of one of the more kind of harrowing aspects of the story, because it's the narrator actually describing what happened to her in the past. She has a relationship at school kind of age, and she has a relationship with an older man, one of her professors, and he gets her pregnant several times. And and actually this is another part of it is set in a hospital at this point, and it takes a kind of figure outside of the family to take responsibility for her after she comes back, I think the third time, having got pregnant. So I didn't really read the maternal materialistic aspect into it, but it was more to do with that kind of intergenerational trauma and repeating mistakes of the past.
Yeah. I mean, interesting you talk about repeating mistakes. I think a different way to the Gran is on the way, Olivia's just said, this kind of return to the older ways. So there is this sort of trope of repetition that comes in, maybe. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the issue of responsibility. I think that's a big one that we can talk about in the next section of our conversation. So I think now is a good time to take a break. Thank you for your insights so far. And for everybody listening and watching, please do join us for part 2.